Eleanor Sinclair had everything a person could ever dream of: wealth, luxury, and status. She lived in a sprawling mansion that stood like a beacon of power in the heart of the city, its grand chandeliers casting golden reflections on polished marble floors. But behind its gilded doors, Eleanor felt like a prisoner. Her father, Nathaniel Sinclair, was one of the most influential businessmen in the country, a man whose name commanded respect and fear in equal measure. To him, power was everything, and control was the currency he valued most. Eleanor had learned this at a young age. She was never given choices, only directives masked as expectations: where to study, what to wear, how to speak. Her entire existence was carefully curated to fit the image of the perfect heiress. But what suffocated her most was the fact that her dreams had no place in his world. Music had been her sanctuary since childhood, the only space where she felt truly alive. Her mother, Richard Sinclair, had been a world-class violinist, and Eleanor had spent endless hours by her side, mesmerized by the way she played. She had dreamed of following in her mother's footsteps, of performing in grand concert halls and bringing music to life. But when Richard passed away under circumstances that still felt shrouded in mystery, Nathaniel shut the music room doors and declared her passion a childish fantasy. "Music is a waste of time," he had told her coldly, the day she tried to plead with him. "Your mother saw that too late, and I won't let you make the same mistake." That day, Eleanor felt something inside her crack, a silent fracture that deepened with every passing year. At 27, she was still trapped, suffocating under the weight of a life she had never chosen. Nathaniel had spent years preparing her to take over Sinclair Holdings, grooming her to become the businesswoman he wanted her to become, the businesswoman he wanted her to be. But no matter how many board meetings she attended, how many business proposals she memorized, she could never summon the passion he expected. "I need your full attention, Eleanor," he would say whenever she drifted during a meeting. "This company is your legacy." But it wasn't hers, it was his, and she wanted nothing to do with it. The final blow came one evening when Nathaniel summoned her to his office. The room was an extension of his personality: dark wood, minimal decor, everything polished and severe. He sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. "I have something important to discuss with you," he said. Eleanor already knew from his tone that whatever it was, it wouldn't be a discussion at all. "You're to be engaged," he continued, watching her carefully. "Gregory Hawthorne is a fine man, from a family of great influence. This arrangement will solidify a partnership that will benefit both our businesses." The air seemed to thicken around her. She stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to laugh and tell her it was just another one of his strategic games. But he didn't. "You can't be serious," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more serious," he replied. A cold weight settled in her chest. He had taken everything from her: her dreams, her choices, her freedom, and now he wanted to take the last thing she had left: the right to decide whom she would love. "I won't do it," she said, her fingers curling into fists. Nathaniel exhaled, slow and measured. "You will." Eleanor felt the walls closing in. She had always obeyed, always conformed. But this time, she knew there was only one way out. She had to run. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the intricate patterns on the ceiling, her mind racing. The words of her father echoed in her head, a constant reminder of the chains he had placed on her life. "You will," he had said, it so simply, as if her fate was not her own, as if her future was nothing more than another business deal to be sealed. But not this time. For years, she had lived in silent rebellion, holding on to the hope that one day she could convince her father to see her, to understand that she was more than just an extension of his empire. But now she saw the truth. Nathaniel Sinclair did not care about her happiness, only about control. And if she stayed, she would be trapped forever. A cold realization settled in her chest. There was no convincing him, no changing his mind. If she wanted freedom, she would have to take it for herself. She had to leave. The thought terrified her. She had never been on her own before. She had never needed to be. Every moment of her life had been planned, every decision made for her. She had no experience living outside the walls of this estate, no knowledge of what it meant to struggle. But despite the fear clawing at her chest, a stronger feeling burned beneath it: determination. She would rather face the unknown than live a life that wasn't hers. Slipping out of bed, she moved quickly. She didn't have much time. If she hesitated, she would lose her nerve. She needed to disappear before morning, before her father or any of the staff could notice she was gone. She grabbed a backpack from her closet, stuffing it with essentials, a few changes of clothes, the small amount of cash she had hidden away, and the only thing that truly mattered to her, her mother's locket. She paused for a moment, fingers tracing the delicate gold pendant before tucking it safely into her bag. Next, she moved to her vanity, picking up a pair of scissors. Her long blonde hair was a signature of the Sinclair name, a mark of her polished, elegant upbringing. If she wanted to disappear, she needed to shed that identity. With one deep breath, she lifted the scissors and began to cut. The strands fell in golden waves around her, each one a symbol of the life she was leaving behind. When she was done, her reflection was almost unrecognizable. Her hair was uneven, jagged at the edges, but she didn't care. This was the first step toward freedom. She changed into a plain hoodie and jeans, clothes that belonged to no particular class, no particular life. Then, slinging the backpack over her shoulder, she crept toward the window. Her room was on the second floor, but she had memorized the layout of the estate long ago. She knew which parts of the garden were hidden from the security cameras, which paths the guards rarely patrolled. She had never needed to use that knowledge before, but tonight it would save her. Carefully, she lowered herself onto the balcony, her heart hammering as she gripped the vine-covered trellis. It was sturdy enough to hold her weight, but the descent was slow, each movement calculated. When she reached the ground, she didn't stop. She moved quickly, staying close to the shadows, her breath shallow as she made her way toward the gate. The estate was vast, with high walls that loomed like a prison, but there was a gap near the east side, a flaw in the design no one had ever considered a threat. She squeezed through, her clothes snagging on the rough stone, and when she finally stepped onto the quiet street beyond, she felt something she hadn't in years: freedom. But there was no time to savor it. She needed to get as far away as possible before morning. Pulling her hood up to hide her face, she walked briskly, her mind racing. She needed to blend in, to disappear into the city. The train station was too risky. Her father would check there first. The bus depot was a better option, where no one would ask questions. As she approached, she kept her head down, scanning the crowd. A late-night bus was boarding, its worn-out sign flickering. Ravenshire. She had never heard of it. Perfect. Without hesitation, she bought a ticket and stepped inside, taking a seat at the very back. The engine rumbled, and as the bus pulled away, she finally exhaled. She was leaving the Sinclair name behind. For the first time in her life, she was no one. And that was exactly what she wanted. Eleanor kept her head down as the bus rumbled through the dark countryside. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of passing streetlights made her eyelids grow heavy, but she refused to sleep. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not yet. With every mile that passed, the weight on her chest lifted. She was finally gone. No more rigid schedules, suffocating expectations, or hollow conversations about business strategies she didn't care about. But the relief was short-lived. The reality of her situation settled over her like a thick fog. She had no real plan, no destination beyond Ravenshire, and no one to turn to. She gripped the strap of her backpack, her fingers brushing against her mother's locket. One step at a time, she reminded herself. For now, all that mattered was finding a place to stay and laying low. The bus came to a stop, just as the first hints of dawn stretched across the sky. Eleanor hesitated before stepping off, the chilled morning air nipping at her exposed skin. Ravenshire was a small town, far different from the towering skyline she had always known. Narrow streets wound through clusters of brick buildings, their shop windows dark at this early hour. A single diner across the road had its lights on, the neon glow of Maggie's diner flickering against the pavement. Her stomach clenched, a sharp reminder that she hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. She pulled her hood lower and crossed the street, stepping inside. The scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, and the warmth of the diner wrapped around her like a long-lost embrace. A handful of early risers sat at the counter, sipping coffee and murmuring quietly to one another. None of them gave her a second glance. Eleanor slid into a corner booth, her fingers cold against the worn tabletop. A waitress, an older woman with salt and pepper hair and kind brown eyes, approached, pen poised over her notepad. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" Eleanor hesitated. She needed to make her money last, but the gnawing hunger in her stomach won the battle. "Just a coffee and toast, please." The waitress gave her a knowing look, like she had seen 100 versions of Eleanor before, people running from something, lost and unsure, but she didn't pry. She just nodded and walked away. Eleanor let out a slow breath. She needed a plan. She had enough money to survive for a while, but eventually she would need work. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had never worked a day in her life, not in the way ordinary people did. The coffee arrived first, hot and strong, and she wrapped her fingers around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her skin. A few moments later, the toast followed. It was simple, plain, but it tasted like freedom. She was halfway through her meal when the bell above the door jingled. A woman stepped inside, shaking off the morning chill. She carried a large woven basket filled with what looked like fresh vegetables, and greeted the waitress by name before sliding into a seat near Eleanor's booth. Their eyes met for only a second, but it was enough. The woman offered a warm smile. First time in Ravenshire? Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether to answer. But something about the woman's gentle demeanor put her at ease. Yeah, she said cautiously. I just got in. Well, welcome. Name's Madeline Porter. She gestured to the basket at her feet. I work over at the Hastings estate. Run the household. More or less. Eleanor nodded, hoping to end the conversation quickly. She didn't want to risk saying too much. But Madeline didn't seem in a hurry to leave. She studied Eleanor with a thoughtful expression. You wouldn't happen to be looking for work, would you? Eleanor's heart skipped. Was it that obvious? I might be, she admitted carefully. Madeline smiled. I had a feeling. The Hastings family is looking for a new housekeeper. The job isn't glamorous, but it comes with room and board. It's honest work, and I have a good feeling about you. Eleanor stiffened. A housekeeper? The idea was almost laughable. She had never cleaned a thing in her life, never even done her own laundry. But she needed to stay hidden, and no one would ever think to look for Eleanor Sinclair scrubbing floors. It was perfect. She met Madeline's gaze and nodded. I'll take it. Eleanor adjusted the worn apron around her waist, the fabric rougher than anything she had ever worn before. The Hastings estate was grand, though not in the same way as her father's. The mansion had an old-world charm, with ivy climbing its stone walls and tall arched windows that cast golden light into the vast hallways. It was elegant, but in a way that felt rigid, as if the house itself demanded a certain level of perfection. Vivian Hastings, the mistress of the estate, made sure of that. You will follow the rules exactly as they are given to you, Vivian had told her on the first day, her voice smooth but firm. Sloppiness is not tolerated. I expect absolute discretion, obedience, and efficiency. Eleanor had nodded, keeping her face neutral. She had expected the woman to be strict, but the sharpness in her gaze made it clear that kindness was not a trait Vivian valued. Then there was Margot Hastings. If Vivian was cold, Margot was cruel. She was in her mid-20s, with striking features and a practiced air of superiority. She barely acknowledged Eleanor at first, too busy inspecting herself in the gilded mirrors or flipping through fashion magazines. But once she realized that Eleanor wasn't just another faceless servant, that she was young, striking in her own understated way, and carried herself with an effortless grace, her demeanor changed. Margot's dark eyes were laced with quiet scrutiny, and Eleanor could feel the weight of her unspoken challenge. You must be new, Margot had said one afternoon, leaning against the doorway as Eleanor dusted an antique bookshelf in the sitting room. Yes, ma'am, Eleanor replied smoothly, keeping her head down. Margot smirked. How? Interesting. From that moment on, Eleanor knew she had gained an unwanted enemy. The days passed in a blur of endless chores, scrubbing floors, washing linens, polishing silverware. Tasks that would have once been beneath her were now part of her daily routine. It was exhausting work, but she welcomed the distraction. The more she busied herself, the less time she had to think about the life she had left behind. But Margot was determined to make things difficult. She would leave her silk dresses strewn across her bedroom floor, then summon Eleanor to pick them up, only to sneer, "You missed a spot." She would demand her tea at precisely the right temperature and send it back 3 times just to watch Eleanor scurry back to the kitchen. And worst of all, she made sure to remind Eleanor of her place whenever she could. "You do realize that people like you don't belong in places like this, right?" Margot said one evening, casually inspecting her nails as Eleanor set a tray of tea before her. Eleanor remained silent, her expression carefully blank. Margot leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a whisper. "I see the way you carry yourself. You're not just some nobody. Who are you really?" For a fraction of a second, Eleanor froze. Then she met Margot's gaze with cool indifference. "I'm exactly who I say I am." Margot tilted her head, her lips curling into a slow smile. "We'll see about that." Eleanor kept her composure as she left the room, but unease settled in her stomach. Margot was perceptive, too perceptive. She needed to be more careful. The only solace in the household was Madeline. Unlike the other staff, who were wary of speaking out of turn, Madeline had a warmth that made the long hours bearable. "You're doing fine, dear," she reassured Eleanor one night as they folded laundry together. "The Hastings women can be difficult, but don't let them get to you." Eleanor forced a smile. "I won't." But as she lay awake in her small attic room that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that her past was creeping closer. Margot was watching her, studying her, and Eleanor knew that if she wasn't careful, her carefully built disguise would crumble, taking her freedom down with it. Eleanor had always known how to fade into the background, how to exist without drawing attention. But that became nearly impossible when Julian Blackwood walked through the doors of the Hastings estate. She had first seen him from across the great hall, his presence impossible to ignore. Tall, effortlessly confident, with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His tailored navy blue suit was impeccable, yet there was an ease in the way he carried himself, as if wealth and power had never been a burden to him. Unlike the other men who often visited the Hastings household, Julian's charisma wasn't forced. It was natural, undeniable, and unfortunately, Margot had made it painfully obvious that she wanted him. "Julian, darling." Margot purred as she greeted him in the parlor, draping herself over his arm like she had been waiting all her life for this moment. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me." Julian's polite smile barely shifted. "I doubt anyone could ever forget you, Margot." Eleanor, standing in the corner with a silver tray of refreshments, kept her gaze fixed downward, pretending she wasn't listening. But she felt his eyes linger on her for just a moment too long. It was a dangerous gaze, the kind that noticed things. Margot, of course, noticed his distraction immediately. "Oh, don't mind her," she said with a casual flick of her wrist, barely glancing at Eleanor. "That's just our new housekeeper. She's nothing special." Eleanor forced herself to remain still, her grip tightening around the tray. She had grown used to Margot's jabs, but hearing those words in front of Julian stung in a way she hadn't expected. Julian's eyes remained on her for a bit longer before he turned back to Margot, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said simply. The rest of the evening, Eleanor did her best to avoid his gaze, but it became clear that Julian wasn't the kind of man who let things slip past him. Over the next several days, he became a frequent visitor, always arriving unannounced, much to Margot's delight. She would entertain him for hours in the sitting room, laughing too loudly at his jokes, finding every excuse to touch his arm. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that he was paying far more attention to her than Margot realized. Every time she walked into the room, she would find his gaze lingering on her, watching, not in the way a man admired a woman, but in the way someone tried to solve a puzzle. It unsettled her. One afternoon, as she was polishing the antique bookshelves in the library, Julian stepped inside alone. Eleanor stiffened, immediately reaching for the nearest book to pretend she was busy. "Do you always clean with such intensity?" he mused, leaning casually against the doorway. Eleanor forced a neutral smile, keeping her eyes on the shelf. "It's part of the job, sir." "Sir," Julian repeated, amusement dancing in his voice. "That's rather formal, don't you think?" She turned slightly, finally meeting his gaze. "I work for the Hastings family." He studied her for a moment before stepping further into the room. "You know," he said slowly, "I can't shake the feeling that we've met before." Eleanor's pulse spiked, but she kept her expression smooth. "Julian," he corrected, "and you are." She hesitated, gripping the book tighter. "Bella." "Bella?" he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "It suits you, I suppose, but it doesn't explain why you seem familiar." Eleanor forced out a light chuckle. "I think you must be mistaken." Julian tilted his head slightly, considering her, and then to her horror, he said, "You carry yourself differently than the other staff here. It's in the way you stand, the way you speak. You're not just a housekeeper, are you?" Her breath caught. For a split second, she considered denying it outright, but something in his gaze told her he wouldn't believe her no matter what she said. So instead, she did the only thing she could. She turned away, pretending not to hear him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, voice steady. "I have work to do." And before he could say another word, she slipped past him, leaving Julian Blackwood standing alone in the library, watching her go. The grand ballroom of the Hastings estate gleamed under the golden glow of the chandeliers. The air buzzed with polite laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the murmured conversations of the city's most elite. Tonight was Margot's gala, an event she had spent weeks boasting about, an exclusive gathering of high society, where only the most powerful, the most wealthy, the most important were welcome. Eleanor had done everything in her power to avoid it. She had planned to stay in the servants' quarters, far away from the opulence that once defined her world, but Vivienne and Margot had other plans. "You're coming with us," Vivienne had declared that morning, her lips curling into a smirk. Every good hostess needs her staff properly trained for events like this, which of course was a thinly veiled excuse to drag Eleanor into whatever twisted scheme Margot had prepared. And now, standing at the far end of the ballroom, clad in an ill-fitting lilac gown that looked like it had been salvaged from a decades-old closet, Eleanor understood exactly what their game was. They wanted to humiliate her. The whispers had started the moment she walked into the room. Gentle snickers behind delicate gloved hands, glances exchanged between women draped in the latest Parisian couture. Some simply stared, their expressions caught between amusement and curiosity. Margot had made sure of it, had given her the most ridiculous dress, had made sure the other guests noticed the help walking among them. Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to let the sting of embarrassment settle in her chest. She had survived far worse. Across the room, she spotted Julian Blackwood, standing with a group of businessmen. He had seen her the moment she entered, his sharp gaze narrowing slightly as he took in her dress, the murmurs of the crowd, the predatory gleam in Margot's eyes. Eleanor quickly averted her gaze, pretending not to notice. "Well, well, look at you," Margot's voice cut through her thoughts. Eleanor turned to see her standing nearby, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "You clean up differently than I expected, though I suppose there's only so much one can do with second-hand fabric." Eleanor forced a polite smile. "The dress is lovely. Thank you for lending it to me." Margot's expression flickered, just for a second, as if she hadn't expected Eleanor to respond with grace instead of embarrassment. But she recovered quickly. "You know," Margot mused, tilting her head, "since you claim to be so talented, why don't you show us?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. Margot turned to the elegantly dressed crowd, raising her voice just enough. "Ladies and gentlemen, our dear housekeeper here says she can play the piano. Isn't that fascinating?" A few heads turned, intrigued. Eleanor's heart pounded. "I think it would be delightful if she proved it." Margot continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What do you all say?" Scattered chuckles and murmurs of approval rippled through the room. This wasn't about showcasing talent. This was about mockery. If she refused, Margot would call her a liar. If she played and failed, she would be humiliated. She swallowed. Think Eleanor. Then, from the crowd, Julian's voice cut through the tension. "I'd love to hear her play." Silence. Margot's smile faltered for the briefest second before she forced a laugh. "Of course you would." Eleanor met Julian's gaze from across the room. There was no mockery there, just curiosity. And something else. Understanding. Taking a slow breath, Eleanor stepped forward. She wasn't playing for them. She was playing for herself. The moment her fingers touched the keys, a hush fell over the room. She chose Claire de Lune, the song her mother used to play, the song that had been locked away from her for so long. The first notes rang through the ballroom, soft and delicate. She let the music take over, let her hands move from memory, pouring every unspoken emotion into each note. The whispers faded. The laughter ceased. Eyes widened. And then, somewhere in the crowd, a single whisper. "She looks like Eleanor Sinclair." Panic surged in Eleanor's chest, but she forced herself to keep playing, fingers steady, despite the cold sweat at the back of her neck. Then came another murmur. "It is her." And then a voice she thought she had escaped forever. "Eleanor." Her fingers froze mid-note. Slowly, She lifted her gaze toward the entrance of the ballroom, her stomach plummeting. Nathaniel Sinclair stood in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone sent a shiver down her spine. Eleanor felt the walls closing in, the weight of her real identity crashing over her like a tidal wave. Margot's eyes were wide with shock. Julian was already stepping forward, his gaze flickering between Eleanor and Nathaniel. And Eleanor? She did the only thing she could. She ran. Eleanor's heartbeat pounded like war drums as she tore through the grand hallway, the gasps and murmurs of the crowd fading behind her. The air felt thick, suffocating, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her father had found her. She sprinted past the towering floral arrangements, past the gilded mirrors that reflected the sheer panic in her wide eyes. The silk of her ill-fitting gown tangled around her legs, slowing her down, tangled around her legs, slowing her down, but she hiked it up and pushed forward. Behind her, she could hear footsteps, heavy, determined. Eleanor! Nathaniel's voice boomed through the ballroom, laced with steel. Stop! Now! Her breath hitched. A familiar, suffocating fear clawed at her throat. She had spent her whole life obeying that voice, but not this time. Bursting through the side doors, she stumbled into the cool night air. The estate's sprawling gardens stretched before her, darkened by the night, the hedges casting long shadows under the dim lanterns. The distant sound of a violin drifted from somewhere in the estate, the irony of it twisting like a knife in her chest. She darted toward the garden's maze, knowing it was her best chance at losing them. Miss Hastings! Call security! A voice, Margot's, shrill and furious, echoed from inside. Damn it! They would be sealing off the exit soon. Eleanor pushed forward, her bare feet stinging against the gravel pathway. Her lungs burned, but she ignored it, weaving through the labyrinth of hedges, her hands grazing the cool leaves as she moved. If she could just make it to the back gate. Suddenly, an arm shot out from the shadows, grabbing her wrist. She yelped, twisting violently to break free, but the grip only tightened. Eleanor, wait. Julian. Her panic didn't subside, but she stilled just enough to take him in. He was slightly out of breath, his dark brows drawn together in a mix of concern and determination. Unlike the others, he hadn't called her Bella. He had called her by her real name. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice shaking. I have to go. I do understand, he said, his voice calm but firm. That's why I'm here. She shook her head. You don't know what he'll do to me. Julian's jaw tightened. I have a pretty good idea. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of more footsteps grew louder. The guards were closing in. Nathaniel was closing in. Julian glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. There's a car waiting at the east exit. It's yours if you trust me. Trust? Eleanor had learned the hard way that trust was dangerous, that people always wanted something. But Julian had never once tried to control her. He had asked questions, yes, far too many, but he had never demanded answers. And right now, she had no other choice. Fine, she breathed. Without another word, Julian grabbed her hand and pulled her into the shadows. Together, they ran. The maze twisted and turned, the towering hedges obscuring their path, but Julian seemed to know exactly where he was going. He moved with purpose, never hesitating. Eleanor didn't dare question him. not when time was slipping away so quickly. Then, up ahead, a flicker of headlights. A sleek black car sat just beyond the garden walls, the back gate slightly ajar. A man in a suit stood beside it, phone pressed to his ear. When he saw them approaching, he nodded briskly and opened the door. "Hurry," Julian urged, his hand steady on her back as she climbed in. She barely had time to settle before Julian slipped in beside her and slammed the door shut. The car lurched forward. Eleanor twisted in her seat, her pulse hammering as she watched the estate grow smaller in the distance. The warm glow of the ballroom flickered behind the trees, the laughter of the oblivious guests still audible even as she disappeared into the night. She had made it. For now. Julian sat beside her, silent. His presence was steady, grounding, but it did nothing to quiet the storm inside her. She had run away before, but now she wasn't just running. She was being hunted. The night swallowed them whole as the car sped down the winding road, the headlights slicing through the darkness. Eleanor pressed her back against the seat, her breath uneven, her fingers digging into the folds of the ill-fitting gown, still clinging to her skin. The adrenaline that had carried her through the past hour was wearing off, leaving behind a raw, frayed edge of exhaustion. Beside her, Julian was silent, his sharp gaze flicking toward the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if expecting to see Nathaniel's men closing in. His presence was calm, steady, but Eleanor could feel the tension simmering beneath his composed exterior. He was assessing, calculating. Finally, she found her voice. "Where are we going?" Julian didn't look at her as he answered, "Somewhere safe." "That's not an answer," she said, forcing strength into her tone despite the tremor in her hands. "Why are you helping me?" That made him glance at her, his expression unreadable in the dim glow of the dashboard. "Because you needed it." Eleanor scoffed. "No one helps without expecting something in return." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "That's a very cynical way of looking at the world." "It's a realistic way of looking at it." Silence stretched between them. Then Julian exhaled, turning his attention back to the road. "Fine. You want the truth. I knew your mother." Eleanor's breath hitched. The word struck like a physical blow, sending her mind spinning. "You? What?" "I met her when I was a teenager," Julian continued, his voice quieter now. "She used to visit my family's estate sometimes. She and my mother were close once." Eleanor stared at him, searching for any sign of deception, but found none. Her mother, Richard Sinclair, a woman whose name was whispered in reverence in music circles, but whose existence had been systematically erased from the Sinclair household after her death. Her father had made sure of that. Julian's voice softened. She was brilliant. The way she played, it was like she could make the world stand still. Eleanor swallowed, her throat tight. She could. A beat of silence passed before Julian spoke again. "She used to talk about you." Eleanor's breath caught. "What did she say?" Julian hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "She worried about you, about what would happen if something ever happened to her." Eleanor clenched her fists. Her mother had known. She had known that if she disappeared, Nathaniel would tighten his grip around Eleanor like an iron vice. And she had been right. The car turned off the main road, slowing as it pulled onto a narrow, unmarked path lined with towering trees. After a few more minutes, the headlights illuminated a secluded cabin nestled between the woods. It was small, unassuming, a far cry from the lavish estates she had grown up in. Julian parked and turned off the engine. "We'll stay here for now. It's safe." Eleanor didn't move. The weight of his revelation pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She turned to him, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know how she died?" Julian's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away, which only made her stomach twist. Finally, he said, "I know what they told the world, that it was an accident." But he hesitated. "I never believed that." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. Her mother's death had always felt off. Nathaniel never spoke about it. No funeral, no mourning, just silence. And when Eleanor had once dared to ask questions, his response had been swift and unforgiving. "Some things are better left buried, Eleanor." But now, she had proof that she wasn't the only one who doubted the official story. Julian's voice was steady. "Your father is hiding something, and I think you already know that." Eleanor swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the locket at her throat. She had spent so long running from Nathaniel, but now for the first time she realized it wasn't enough to run. She had to uncover the truth. The cabin was silent except for the faint rustling of leaves outside, the wind whispering through the trees like a ghost of the past. Eleanor sat stiffly in the worn leather armchair near the fireplace, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her mother's locket. Julian had disappeared into the other room, giving her space, but his words still echoed in her mind. "Your father is hiding something, and I think you already know that." She had always felt it, the emptiness surrounding her mother's death, the way Nathaniel refused to speak of it, the way the entire world had accepted the story with no questions asked. It had been ruled an accident, a car crash, no witnesses, no further investigation. But now, with Julian's revelation, that fragile story unraveled like a loose thread. Eleanor sucked in a breath, forcing herself to focus. If Nathaniel was hiding something, then the answers wouldn't be out here in the middle of nowhere. They would be at Sinclair Manor, locked away in his office, buried beneath layers of secrecy. She needed to go back. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Walking straight into her father's stronghold was madness. If he caught her, he wouldn't let her slip through his fingers again. But there was no other way. A creak sounded from the wooden floorboards behind her. Julian leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying her, with that sharp, unreadable expression of his. "You're planning something," he said simply. Eleanor met his gaze, hesitating only for a moment. "I need to go back to the estate." Julian exhaled, shaking his head. "That's the worst idea you've had yet." "I don't have a choice," she shot back. "If my father had something to do with my mother's death, I need to find proof." "You don't even know what you're looking for." "I'll figure it out when I get there." His jaw tightened. "You really think you can just waltz into Sinclair Manor, dig through your father's secrets, and walk out unscathed?" "I don't think," she said, standing up. "I know." Julian let out a dry laugh, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You're unbelievable." Eleanor crossed her arms. "You said you wanted to help me." He sighed. "I did. That doesn't mean I'm thrilled about you running headfirst into danger." She softened slightly. I won't ask you to come with me. Julian studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. You don't have to, because there's no way in hell I'm letting you do this alone. A flicker of something warm, something dangerously close to trust, settled in her chest. She nodded. Then we leave at midnight. The estate loomed in the darkness, its massive iron gates locked tight. But Eleanor knew the grounds like the back of her hand. She led Julian along the outer wall, stopping at the east side, where a cluster of overgrown vines covered an old maintenance entrance. Wait here, she whispered. I'll check if it's still unlocked. Julian grabbed her wrist. Be careful. She swallowed and nodded before slipping through the vines, pressing her palm against the door. To her relief, it creaked open. She gestured for Julian to follow. Inside, the air was thick with polished wood and the faint scent of cigars. Nathaniel's scent. Her stomach twisted. The house was eerily quiet, the staff likely asleep, but she knew better than to let her guard down. They moved swiftly through the hallways, their footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs. As they approached Nathaniel's office, Eleanor's pulse quickened. She reached for the door handle. Locked. Julian pulled something from his pocket, a thin metal tool, and within seconds, the lock clicked open. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Julian smirked. I have many skills. She pushed the door open and slipped inside. The office was exactly as she remembered, grand, cold, and meticulously arranged. But Eleanor knew her father well. If he was hiding something, it wouldn't be in plain sight. She moved to the desk, running her hands along the mahogany surface. There has to be something. Julian was already scanning the bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines, testing for false backs. Then, Eleanor's fingers brushed against the edge of a drawer. She pulled it open, empty, but when she pressed her hand inside, her fingers met something uneven. A false bottom. Her heart pounded as she pried it open, revealing a stack of old documents, letters, and a death certificate. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Julian appeared at her side. What is it? She lifted the paper with shaking fingers. It wasn't her mother's. It was hers. Eleanor Sinclair. Deceased. Her blood ran cold. Julian's expression darkened as he scanned the document. What the hell is this? Eleanor couldn't breathe. Nathaniel hadn't just wanted to control her life. He had already declared it over. Eleanor's hands trembled as she stared at the document. The bold letters spelling out her name, followed by a single word, deceased. Her lungs felt tight, as though the air had been sucked from the room. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no logical explanation. She was standing here. She was alive. And yet, according to this paper, Eleanor Sinclair had been declared dead. Julian hovered beside her, his expression unreadable as he skimmed the document. His usual composure had fractured, replaced by something sharp and cold. This isn't just some mistake, he murmured, his voice low. This was deliberate. Eleanor swallowed hard, her pulse thundering in her ears. She felt the weight of Julian's gaze, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the paper. The date, the official date of her death, 1 week after her mother's accident. Her breath hitched. Nathaniel hadn't just erased her mother. He had erased her too. Julian reached for the stack of papers beneath the death certificate. His fingers sifted through legal documents, medical records, fabricated proof that Eleanor Sinclair had perished in an unspecified accident. No details, no cause of death, just a neatly closed chapter in her father's world. Eleanor clenched her jaw, her vision blurring. "He planned this," she whispered. "He." The sound of footsteps echoed outside the office. Eleanor's entire body went rigid. Julian reacted instantly, grabbing her wrist and yanking her toward the bookshelves. He pressed her into the shadows just as the office door swung open with a heavy thud. A figure stepped inside. Nathaniel Sinclair. Eleanor barely suppressed a gasp as she pressed herself deeper into the darkness. The dim glow from the hallway illuminated his tall frame, his tailored suit unwrinkled, his expression calm, though calm. He knew someone had been in here. Nathaniel strode toward his desk, his fingers grazing the mahogany surface. He lingered, scanning the room like a predator, scenting the air for prey. Then his voice cut through the silence. "Did you really think I wouldn't know?" Eleanor's heart stopped. He was speaking to her. She felt Julian tense beside her, his grip tightening ever so slightly. Nathaniel exhaled, shaking his head. "You're as reckless as your mother was." He turned, his sharp eyes flickering over the darkened room. "But I always knew you'd come back. You couldn't help yourself." Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, willing her heartbeat to slow. Nathaniel stepped closer to the bookshelf, his fingers tapping idly against the spines of the books. "Do you know what your biggest mistake was, Eleanor?" His tone was almost bored, as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. "You always felt too much. Your mother was the same way, sentimental, emotional, and look where it got her." Eleanor's breath hitched. Julian, standing just inches away from her, barely moved, but she could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. Nathaniel continued, his voice dropping lower. "I did what had to be done. She would have destroyed everything I built, just like you." Eleanor's stomach twisted. There it was, the confession she had always suspected but never heard. He had done it. He had killed her mother. Something inside her snapped. Before she could stop herself, Eleanor moved. She stepped from the shadows, her breath ragged, her fingers curling into fists. Nathaniel's eyes locked onto her instantly, but he didn't look surprised. He looked amused. "There you are," he said smoothly. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Eleanor's chest heaved. "You murdered her." Nathaniel sighed. "I cleaned up a mess." Her nails dug into her palms. "You ruined her life. You tried to ruin mine." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I did more than try, Eleanor." Eleanor's vision blurred with rage, but Julian was suddenly there, stepping in front of her, his stance firm, protective. Nathaniel barely acknowledged him. "And you," he said, tilting his head at Julian. "I should have known you'd be sniffing around where you don't belong." Julian's expression remained unreadable, but his voice was like ice. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Nathaniel exhaled, as if he found the entire conversation tedious. "This little act of rebellion ends now. The car is waiting outside. You're coming home, Eleanor." Eleanor shook her head, her nails biting into her skin. "I'd rather die than go back with you." Nathaniel's expression flickered, just for a second. "You already did, remember?" The word sent a cold chill down her spine. Then, an alarm sounded. Nathaniel's head snapped toward the door. The guards. Julian moved. He grabbed Eleanor's hand and ran. Nathaniel's furious shout echoed behind them, but they were already through the hallway, their feet pounding against the polished floors. "Stop them!" Eleanor barely registered the voices of the approaching guards. Her only focus was the doorway ahead, the exit. Julian yanked the door open, and the cold night air hit them like a shock. The estate grounds stretched before them, the iron gates just ahead. A sleek black car sat idling near the entrance. "Go!" Julian shouted. Eleanor didn't hesitate. They ran. Behind them, Nathaniel's men burst through the doorway, shouts filling the air. But Eleanor didn't look back. She could see freedom just beyond the gates. She would never be his prisoner again. The cold night air burned in Eleanor's lungs as she ran, her bare feet barely touching the gravel driveway. Behind her, the shouts of Nathaniel's men grew louder, but she didn't dare look back. Julian was just ahead, his grip firm around her wrist as they raced toward the car, waiting by the gates. The driver's side door flung open, and Detective Cooper, the private investigator Nathaniel had hired weeks ago, stepped out, his sharp eyes locked onto Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "Get in," Julian ordered. But Eleanor hesitated. Cooper worked for her father. Could she trust him? "You don't have a choice, sweetheart," Cooper said flatly, yanking open the back door, "unless you want to end up back under your daddy's thumb." There was no time to argue. Eleanor dove into the back seat, Julian sliding in beside her. Cooper slammed the door shut and peeled away from the estate, just as the guards reached the gates. Bullets cracked through the night, shattering the rear windshield. Eleanor ducked instinctively, her pulse hammering. Julian turned to Cooper. "You couldn't have told me they were armed." Cooper smirked, swerving onto the highway. "Figured you'd rather be surprised." Eleanor's breath came fast, her hands gripping her torn dress. The adrenaline hadn't faded, but she forced herself to focus. They had made it out. But she knew Nathaniel. He wouldn't stop until she was back under his control. Julian turned to her, concern flickering behind his calm facade. "Are you okay?" Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "No?" He nodded as if he expected that answer. "We have to take him down." She swallowed. "We need proof. What we found in his office, my death certificate, the forged documents, it's enough to expose him." Cooper scoffed from the front seat. "You think a couple of old papers are enough to bring down Nathaniel Sinclair? That man has more connections than the government." Eleanor clenched her jaw. "Then we need something bigger." Silence filled the car. Then Julian spoke. "We need a confession." Eleanor met his gaze, realization dawning between them. A confession. Recorded, undeniable, and impossible to erase. Cooper sighed, gripping the wheel. "You people are gonna get me killed." But Eleanor straightened her shoulders, the fear inside her hardening into something stronger. Resolve. Nathaniel had spent his life controlling her, manipulating her, erasing the things he didn't want the world to see. But he wouldn't erase her. Not this time. She wasn't running anymore. She was going to end this. Eleanor sat in the dimly lit motel room, staring at the small recording device resting in her palm. It felt impossibly light for something that could bring her father's empire crumbling to the ground. The plan was dangerous, reckless even, but it was the only way. Julian leaned against the desk, arms crossed, watching her carefully. You don't have to do this yourself. Eleanor lifted her gaze, determination burning in her chest. Yes, I do. If I want to be free, I have to be the one to end it. Cooper, lounging in the chair near the window, let out a low whistle. Something in Eleanor's chest tightened at that. Julian pushed off the desk. All right, we'll be nearby, but once you step into that house, you're on your own. She nodded, shoving the recorder into the pocket of her coat. Let's finish this. Nathaniel Sinclair's office was exactly as she had left it. Cold, calculated, and devoid of warmth. He stood by the window, swirling a glass of whiskey, his back to her. You're either braver than I thought or more foolish, he said without turning. Eleanor stepped forward, keeping her hands steady. I came for answers. Nathaniel let out a dry chuckle. You already know the answers, Eleanor. You wouldn't be here otherwise. Her nails dug into her palms. Why? Why did you kill her? Finally, he turned. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. Because she was weak, he said simply. She wanted to leave. To take you with her. She thought she could just walk away from everything I built. So I handled it. Eleanor's stomach churned, but she didn't let herself flinch. And me? She pressed. You faked my death. You erased me. Nathaniel took a slow sip of his drink. You were always too much like her. You felt too much, questioned too much. But I gave you a chance, a life most people would kill for. And yet here you are, throwing it all away. Eleanor swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Her fingers curled around the recorder in her pocket, the small red light blinking unseen. You don't own me, she said, her voice steady, and you never will. Nathaniel's expression darkened. We'll see about that. A sharp knock interrupted them. Eleanor's heart pounded. A moment later, the doors burst open, and Detective Cooper strode in, followed by two officers. Nathaniel barely had time to react before Cooper held up the recorder. Well, Mr. Sinclair, he drawled, that's quite the confession you just gave us. For the first time in her life, Eleanor saw something close to fear flicker across her father's face. The officers moved in, snapping the cuffs around his wrists. This isn't over, Nathaniel snarled, his cold gaze locking onto Eleanor. You'll regret this. Eleanor exhaled, something inside her finally breaking free. No, she said, her voice unwavering. For the first time in my life, I won't. As they led her father away, Julian appeared beside her, his warmth grounding her. It's over, he murmured. Eleanor turned to him, a slow smile forming. No, Julian. She looked toward the open doors, toward the world waiting beyond the walls that had trapped her for so long. It's just beginning. Lessons from Eleanor's story. Eleanor's journey teaches us a powerful lesson about courage, self-worth, and reclaiming control over our own lives. She spent years being shaped by her father's expectations, believing she had no choice but to follow the path he set for her. But the truth is, freedom is a choice. It is not always an easy one, and it often comes with fear, uncertainty, and sacrifice. But staying trapped in a life that isn't yours is far worse. One of the greatest lessons Eleanor learned is that power is not about wealth or influence. It's about knowing who you are and standing firm in your truth. Nathaniel tried to erase her, control her, and dictate her future, but he underestimated the strength of a person who refuses to be silenced. This story also reminds us that sometimes we have to confront our past to break free from it. Running away may give temporary relief, but true freedom comes from facing the people who try to define us and proving that we are more than what they made us believe. Lastly, Eleanor's story shows that help can come from unexpected places. No one fights alone, and the people who stand by you in your darkest moments are the ones who matter most, So ask yourself, are you living the life you truly want? Or are you still letting someone else decide for you? If this story resonated with you, let us know where you're from in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Your journey to freedom starts with a single step. Take it.